Apologies at the beginning because I lost some of my voice a couple of days ago, but hopefully you can hear me well. So today we're going to talk about the F in FOSS and what the F might entail. Free, but free is not just money-wise, but freedom has lots of different, lots of different views, and that's what I'm going to explore today. Very quick, who am I about me? My name is Ahmed Sobeh. I am an engineering manager at Ivan's open source program office. Our open source program office is mainly focused on contributing upstream, so we experience a lot of open source problems on a daily basis. I've worked with and led diverse teams throughout my careers, and we're going to see how that's relevant today. And I'm on the advisory board for the Joomla Foundation. And below you can find some links for my socials. Okay, I'm going to take this off. Cool. Right, so a quick background about today's topic, because today I'm going to talk about issues you might find a bit trivial or struggles you might not relate to, or problems that you might think, how is someone even still struggling with this? But I assure you that it's none of what I just said. These are real problems that open source developers actually face in developing countries. And as someone who's born and raised in a developing country, I'm originally from Egypt, from Alexandria specifically. Whenever I go back home, and I have very close ties to my community, and I go back home quite often, several times per year, there's this bemusement when I talk to anyone in the tech industry, or any industry for that matter, about what I do, working in a company or in a team that works on upstream work that doesn't bring direct financial benefit to the company. It's just something that people cannot grasp or understand, because that's how open source, or that's how tech is understood in these regions. You make a product, you monetize it, you sell it, you get acquired, or you become famous, and that's how things go. So, but working on open source exclusively is something that is very difficult to understand in lots of these regions. And that's for lots of reasons that we're going to explore today. But first, let us just take a very quick pause to understand what is a developing country. Because the term has changed a lot and became sort of an umbrella to a group of different countries. Because when the term was first coined in 1960 by Walt Whitman, it just divided the world into developing countries and countries that are trying to develop or on their way in becoming developed at some point. So you either have some means to become a developing country at some point, or you're already there. That's just the division that happened at the point, but now it became much more sophisticated and much more complex. Does it mean now what it meant at that point? As I just said, it covers a wider range of countries, some of them fortunate, some of them much less fortunate. Starting with countries that are actually developing, countries that have what is needed to become developed at some point in the future. They have the financial power, they have the option of a free government that can help progress the country with the passing of the years into becoming an actual developed country. And there are countries that are trying to develop, and I would categorize my own country as one of those countries that have some parts of the recipe, some parts of the equation, but they're missing a lot. So they keep trying and failing and trying and failing. 2 steps forward, 1 backwards, 2 steps backward, 1 forward, and then things don't really progress at that point. And the last type is stagnant countries. And the word stagnant doesn't really doesn't describe the situation of these countries very accurately. And as a native Arabic speaker, the Arabic language does have a way of describing specific situations very accurately. So this specific the situation that these countries find themselves in can be, in Arabic, they're called al-dawal al-mutakhalifa, which means countries that have been left behind. And that's very accurate description of what actually happened to these countries. The world has progressed. Ignore the culture and all these kind of aspects, but technologically, the world has left these countries behind, basically. Developed in many different ways, and these countries are left behind. They have no ways of catching up. There is no, it sounds a bit grim, but there is no way for them to catch up with the current situation as it is. So now let's talk about the current state of open source in these regions and countries that we just covered. And I'm a huge believer in storytelling and using stories to deliver or try to describe a situation or describe how a situation is currently unfolding. So I have 2 separate incidents from 2 separate parts of the world, both developing, just to see how people perceive open source in these regions. So the first one is an actual conversation from Twitter, or X, but I'm still going to call it Twitter. An angry person took to Twitter to say, they stole our work and they're building new stuff with it. So this person is someone from a developing country who currently works at one of the biggest tech companies in the world, a behemoth of the tech industry. And they built one of the biggest tech products that we know, but they built it on an open source product, basically. And this person actually works on that open source product. And that product was taken by another company, another behemoth, and they built another product that now is reshaping how we view the world, or how we review the internet, basically. So this person is quite angry about that, because they view this as something unacceptable. A random person responds asking, isn't that the whole point of open source? You did something that is open, others can use it, and they can build their own product, and that's how it is. The response is, maybe it is, but still stealing in my view. So this is someone who does not lack the tech experience or the tech knowledge, given how they work as such a behemoth, but they still do not understand open source. The discussion shows a complete lack of understanding of what is the essence of open source, what open source actually entails. This is a different situation. I was in this actual situation 9 or 10 years ago, before my open source journey started, which isn't that long, to be fair. I started like 5-6 years ago. And one of the very few people back in my country who actually care about open source asked this question at a team meeting, asking, what does open source actually mean to you? He asked this question to a room of 4 or 5 people. And these are the questions, the answers that he received. First answer was, it's free software that I can use without paying. So just focusing on the financial aspect, the freedom from finances. You don't have to pay for this. I do not have to go to payroll to ask for this to be invoiced. I can just download it and use it. Second answer was, I gotta check with IT before I install any of those. Well, it shows a lack of understanding of open source. If it's open source, if it's free, it must be unsafe, which is completely untrue, because some of the biggest tech companies are built on open source projects and are completely safe. Third answer was, I gotta check with the security team before I use any of those. Same concern about open source projects, unsafe. And my own answer was, I don't have to wait for the next release, I can just fix the bug myself locally. So I just was very selfish at the point. I developed as a person since then. But that was my view, that I can just use the software, improve it for my own use. I didn't even think about contributing back upstream. I just use it and that's it. And all these answers just show you the complete lack of understanding of what is the point of open source. Open source for people in less developed places only presents a window or an opportunity for personal gain or personal development. It's not a character issue, it's not a culture issue, but in an environment that's quite competitive and quite lacking in lots of resources, this is what you can actually do. Try to find every single potential chance to advance your own career or advance your own project, basically. So in the longer version of this talk, which is like 45 minutes, I go through the state of open source in different areas and different continents or different developing regions. But today I chose the one for the country, the continent that I come from. These are the African statistics on GitHub. In 2010, more than 50% of contributions for open source on GitHub were from South Africa. But that was challenged over the years, reaching into the early 2020s. Now, in the lead, there is Nigeria. Second place comes Kenya. Egypt and South Africa come third and fourth, and other countries are contributing. And if anyone looks at this, the first question they would ask themselves is, what's wrong with this picture? This looks good. There used to be only one country that's participating, now much more countries. It's quite diverse, it's quite spread out. But this is what's wrong with this picture. So in 2010, less than 0.5% of all the open source contributions on GitHub came from Africa, a continent where almost 20% of the world population actually resides. Going into the early 2020s, that number rose to, didn't really rise, but it's around 2% of the entire contributions on GitHub for open source projects. And this is not, it's not an accurate reflection of the amount of talent and amount of abilities that are actually present in the continent. Anyone who's been to any open source conference in Africa would know this and would see the amount of people that actually turn up to these conferences. They're full of interest and they're full of knowledge and experience. So, well, in this part of the talk, I usually dwell on the importance of open source and why should we care about open source in general and secondary in these regions. But I guess with the context of the conference, everyone understands this already. Everyone knows why we should care about open source. But the second part I want to address is why should we care about open source in these regions? It's because of the insane amount of talent that actually exists in these regions. This is the list of the top 10 countries to outsource software development to in 2022. You can see all of them are developing or trying to develop, and only 3 of them are either actually developed or late developing, basically. The rest are all countries that are, well, basically struggling in different aspects. So this tells us that this is already a known fact, basically. People in the developed world know the amount of talent that exists. They know how good these people are, or else they wouldn't have outsourced work to them for lower wages, unfortunately. But yeah, that just shows us that this is common knowledge at this point. It's not something that's unknown. So now let's dive into the challenges that open source developers, open source communities, and people associated with open source actually go through in these regions and these countries. And I base it on 3 main pillars of issues, starting with society and culture, going through resources and infrastructure, and economics in general, and last but not least, governance, which is a common issue. I guess it's not just for developing countries, but it has a different face in these areas. So I will start with society and culture. And unfortunately, as we know, we live in a society, and the culture of the society affects everything in it. And the tech culture in a country or in an area feeds off the culture of well, how the people are living, basically. So it's very understandable that, well, you can see that in the more developed areas of the world, open source is thriving, it's expanding, people care about it. We have conferences like this with lots of people showing up. But in less fortunate areas, this is not the situation because of the differences in culture and the differences that cause the struggles we're going to talk about. So if you try to imagine the perfect culture where open source can thrive and projects can be sustained and maintained in a perfect way, I imagine this society or this culture to be first very open and transparent, which is a huge problem in these regions. It's, well, most information is red taped. It's not available to the average civilian, the average person. And that, well, that kind of culture doesn't really help open source at all. Information should be as freely and publicly accessible as possible, which is the foundation for open source, basically. Second is free, and free has so many different meanings. There's freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of journalism. There are so many meanings, but today we're gonna be focusing on freedom to start smaller communities and form groups, basically, which is also a huge issue in these regions. Trying to start a new community or trying to start a new meetup or something like this is very difficult in these areas because it's usually, well, I wouldn't say immediately prosecuted, but monitored, closely, very closely monitored, and then sometimes prosecuted and actually shut down. This is the essence of starting an open source project. Distributed modes of collaboration in which large groups of people work together without a strongly centralized authority, without answering to anyone. People govern their own project, they work together to make the project successful, which is a huge issue in the culture because governing, authority, and the government, they all go hand in hand in most of these regions, unfortunately. And the last point is dynamic. A dynamic culture is extremely important for open source to thrive, basically. And that's also a huge problem. I wouldn't say it would be unfair to paint that part of the world with not being dynamic because I guess all cultures and all societies went through that phase. But being resistant to change and preferring to stick with traditional methods, it's always a problem when it comes to open source because people trust what they know, they trust what they have, they trust what's already working, and to introduce open source in these regions, that would be a huge challenge. But if we go back a step and ask ourselves why? Why do people in these regions, why aren't they very open to change or to adopting new ways and technologies? The main answer would be fear of the unknown, which is also something that we can't just claim that happens in the less developed world. It happens everywhere, basically. But the 2 reasons for it in the less developed world are the different ones. Number one is competence. Second is accountability. Just imagine a situation when you go to a supermarket owner who's been using well, any commercial software to do their own ins and outs and their inventory, and you offer them an open source solution, or let's say you even offer them another commercial solution. They will be very resistant to do this, even if it's better price, better service, better customer service, because they trust what they know. They do not trust the competency of the other solution because they know there is no accountability. If something goes wrong, they know no one will help them, no one will protect them. If they go to court over anything, nothing will come out of it, and they will never get what they actually deserve. So for them, it's much easier to stick what they have, what's already working, what their neighboring shop is doing, what their other shop across the street is doing, and so on. So for them, changing their ways is quite difficult. Next, we go to the biggest struggle in my opinion, which is economy and infrastructure. Starting with issues of access, and access is not just financial access. There is access to equipment and the internet. I've seen lots of people during my study at university who did not have access to high-speed internet, and that was in 2013, 2012. They still had to wait for the weekend to go somewhere and they're computer science students. They're not people working in marketing or any other branch. They were studying computer science, still no access to high-speed internet. The digital divide in these countries is huge. It's much bigger than I can actually imagine. There are a privileged few, like myself. I did have access to high-speed internet, but most of the people do not actually. And access to equipment. It's not just an issue of finances. Yes, a very huge part of the population would not be able to afford, let's say they decided to learn how to work with a specific big project just to improve their skills, to learn a new stack or learn how to work with a project in general. The first problem would be not having enough cash to afford the adequate equipment that they would need. But there's the issue of the ability of this equipment on the market from the beginning. Even if you had the money, that doesn't mean you can be able to get the machine that you need to build this project. Otherwise, you're going to just be building the project in 12 hours, and obviously, in 2 days, you're giving up on the whole thing. Which makes education and self-learning very, very difficult. As I just said, if you don't have the equipment, you're not going to bother with learning about things, even if you're just doing it on your own, even if you don't need anyone else. And it becomes very difficult to create a community this way. Even if some of the privileged few, like myself, do start a project, they do form sort of a maintainers group that do maintain the project. That's not a community. They're just a selection of 4 or 5 people who can actually further the project and improve it, but no one else is participating. And people who are participating are doing it in a very, very splattered manner. Next, we go to the issue of funding, which is quite obvious because of the economic struggles that these regions go through. Projects would depend on the individuals, as I just said, on some of the privileged few individuals, and that applies to the privileged ones, and the rest of the population would prioritize paid work, which makes complete sense. If I'm working on an open source project and dedicating 4 or 5 hours per day from my time, and the chance of a second job, not even a first job, comes up, I would definitely drop the open source project because I need more money to support my family, to support myself. So I would definitely prioritize paid work on open source support, basically. And that makes it almost impossible with lack of funding. There isn't enough money in the economy, basically, to start documentation campaigns or marketing and community building events. Almost impossible in these regions, which makes it also very, very difficult to attract or maintain volunteers to help with the project, which is a very important intro to the next issue, which is the issue of localization. I know this will be something that's quite surprising for lots of people, but a project being written in English or being documented in English doesn't mean it's easy. English is the language of the internet. I guess 2/3 of the world would be speaking English, maybe half the world speaks English. I don't know the actual numbers, but yeah, English is very prevalent in lots of regions, but still lots of people cannot contribute to projects. They know enough English to code, obviously, because coding is in English, but they cannot understand what the project is about. Even if they know the purpose of the project, but they cannot understand the design documents or how the architecture is built because everything is written in English. So that makes it very difficult to have any kind of localization for documentation or for any documents related to the project. No entry point for people in these regions. It becomes very, very difficult to get started on a project. Even if you have some English skills, you try for a bit and then you get frustrated and you stop completely. And these times and resources needed would discourage potential contributors, even if it was ones who do have the resources and do have the time. But still, not being able to have an entry point into the project makes it very difficult. Last, we go to the issue of governance, and I think governance is an issue, an open source issue everywhere in the world, but it has its own different view in these regions. Starting with employee contracts, almost all, I do not like to use the 100% statement, but almost all employee contracts in these regions are set in a way to monetize every single thought, every single contribution, every single project that you might build at any point in time, as long as you're employed by the company. So lots of engineers or ICs in different companies, they refrain from doing anything open source related because they don't want to get in trouble, basically. And I guess people so I live in Germany, in Munich, and even if the laws were like this, I would still do it because I know there are intellectual property laws that would protect me. Even if my company went to court over something I did, I know there's a chance of me being protected in some capacity, but in these regions, it's almost impossible. Because even the intellectual property laws are all favoring corporates, basically. So people just do not bother, even if they have the time, even if they have the need, they just drop it completely and do something else because there's no point to go into legal issues in these areas, basically. And there is the last point, proprietary software deals. So tech companies in the US and in Europe, they go into 20, 30-year deals with governments in these regions to supply them with commercial software, as well as it usually happens, to lock them in for the very long term. Let's say someone on the off chance gets elected into an influential position in one of these countries and tries to change things, decides to drop commercial software, wants to adopt open source. There's no way they can afford with the budget they have to pay the payouts to get out of these deals. And there's also the ugly face of corruption. You've got people getting cuts from these deals. I guess it's a very similar analogy to what they do with actual governments, basically. You have people getting cuts to stay in position, keep the status quo, and keep things as they are. So you've got to jump over that hoop too. So there are a few things that we can do to not solve the situation or not make it completely better, but just to improve the situation a bit. Starting with inner source. And I guess most people are familiar with inner source, but inner source is the practice of open source inside organizations or inside companies or inside foundations or stuff of the sort. Inner source in these communities would be a very good stepping stone to open source, and we'll see how that happens now. What could we gain from inner source adoption in these regions? The first point is because of most of the governance methods in these regions are very authoritative. So decision comes from above, everyone follows it. If this does actually happen, if we try to adopt inner source in any of these regions, any of the governmental institutions in these regions, the culture of open source will start developing, even if it's just in very close quarters or within the same organizations, but still people will understand that I can share this with the other team, I can share this with the other department, and from there some kind of open source culture will start building. And building open source expertise, people will start to understand the best practices of open source. How can I share with the other team? How can I share with the other department? What do people usually do in these situations? Yes, it's still a bit closed, it's not completely open, but still it's a stepping stone to the right direction. And initiatives will eventually arise. People will understand what open source is all about, in the hope that at some point open source will be adopted. A few ideas for governance, although I do not think any of them are doable given how governments are in these regions, but creating favorable intellectual property laws. Of course, that's quite obvious, changing the laws to help developers. Creating partnerships with open source organizations, which I guess is a bit doable, partnering up with the Eclipse Foundation or the Apache Foundation, any kind of foundations to have meetups, have events where just to raise awareness of what open source is. And supporting community-driven initiatives, which is a bit difficult given how authoritative everything is, but that's another idea. And lastly is stuff that we can do as the community would be letting people from these regions and areas into our projects and helping them become actual contributors to open source projects. There are a few stuff that we can do. Cultural acceptance, understanding that people come from different cultures, different signs mean different things in different areas of the world, in different cultures. Be open, be understanding. I linked to a talk that a colleague of mine, Claude Warren, gave at FOSS that talks about cultural relativism and understanding how things are different in different cultures and not to get offended by specific ways or not to misunderstand how people communicate in open source projects. It's a very good talk. It would give you a great insight into this. Mentorship, which could be a lot to ask in some cases, but trying to mentor, if you see someone sending emails to the mailing list of a project that you work on, needing help, it seems like the English is broken, try to help them, try to mentor them into getting their first contribution in. Maybe you help them into becoming a regular contributor of the project, which is something that the whole community would benefit from. And use your languages. I know English, as I just said, is the most spoken language in the world, but if you speak Spanish, you unlock huge regions of the world. If you speak Arabic, if you speak Mandarin, whatever language you know other than English, try to use it as much as possible because that helps you onboard more people into projects, basically. That was all I had. These are not all the struggles that people go through in these regions. That's not everything, and these are not all the ways that we can help improve the situation, but this is just a summary of what we can actually do. The QR code leads you to the slides. It has all the links and all the sources, basically. And that was all. Thank you very much.